I didn't think I'd be treated like this in my own home. I never thought I'd spend the final stretch of my life sleeping in a cold, damp basement. In the very house I paid off myself. But that's exactly where I found myself at 66 years old, lying on a creaky cot, my legs covered by a thin blanket, listening to the muffled laughter of my daughter and her husband upstairs. In my kitchen, watching my TV, and the part that still turns my stomach, I gave them this house, freely, lovingly, with my own 2 hands trembling as I signed over the deed. Let me take you back. 3 years ago, my daughter Olivia and her husband Derek were struggling. Their second child was on the way. They were drowning in medical bills, and the tiny apartment they rented was falling apart. Olivia came to me in tears. "Mom, we don't know what to do. We're trying, but we're falling behind." Derek says he's going to pick up a 3rd job, but I interrupted her. I'd already been thinking about it anyway. My house, a modest 2-story place with a backyard full of roses and memories, was fully paid off. My late husband and I built our lives there. And while I had dreams of aging peacefully in it, a part of me wanted to see it filled with children's laughter again. So I made the choice. I gifted it to her. Signed the ownership over with no conditions. I told her, "This house is yours now. Just keep a room for me if I ever need it." Her eyes filled with tears. She hugged me, whispering, "You'll always have a home with us, Mama." I believed her. For a while, everything was fine. I stayed in my condo across town, visited every Sunday, helped with the kids. Derek was polite, distant, but never rude. I chalked it up to stress. But 6 months ago, things changed. I fell. Hard. Shattered my hip on my kitchen floor. Surgery went well, but recovery was another story. I couldn't drive. I couldn't climb stairs. My insurance covered some home visits, but I still needed help bathing, walking, cooking. That's when I called Olivia. I didn't want to impose, but I thought, surely, after all I'd done, staying with them for a while wasn't too much to ask. She hesitated. I could hear Derek in the background saying something. Then she said, "Of course, Mom, just until you get back on your feet." I sold my condo, gave away most of my furniture, packed only what I needed, assuming this was my last stop. When I arrived, I noticed something strange right away. My old bedroom? Gone, turned into a private office for Derek. The guest room? Olivia's home yoga studio. I stood in the hallway, stunned, leaning on my walker, when Derek came downstairs, clapped his hands together, and said with a grin, "We've got the basement set up for you." The basement. Dark, unfinished, smelling of mildew and old paint. They'd thrown a mattress on top of storage boxes and laid a rug over the concrete. No closet. One tiny window. A space heater that barely worked. I swallowed hard and said thank you. I didn't want to make a scene. I was the guest now, wasn't I? At least that's how they treated me. What started as small things, a forgotten dinner plate, an offhand comment, grew into something uglier. Derek would turn the heat down at night to save energy, knowing the basement froze like a meat locker. He locked the thermostat upstairs. Olivia started skipping our evening chats, too tired or too busy. And the worst part? They started treating me like a burden. "Mom, can you not leave your walker near the hallway? The kids trip on it. Can you maybe wash your laundry at night? The washer's loud during the day." One night, I heard Derek mutter under his breath, "This is what we get for being too generous." Too generous. With my house, I cried myself to sleep that night. The mattress dipped in the middle, and my hip ached, and the silence of that basement felt like being buried alive. For a while, I thought maybe I was being too sensitive, but everything changed last Tuesday. I had asked Olivia, just asked, if I could join them for dinner. I'd heard them laughing and didn't want to eat alone again. Derek looked up from his plate and said, "Honestly, it's been nice having the evenings just the 4 of us. You've been kind of hovering lately." Olivia said nothing, just stared at her plate. I nodded, holding back tears, and turned to go downstairs. And that's when I realized something crystal clear. They didn't think I had options. They thought I was stuck, old, weak, dependent. But what they didn't know was that I had one call left to make. Just one. And that call, it would change everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not just because of the cold or the ache in my hip or the way the wind howled outside that little basement window, but because my mind was finally awake. For months, I told myself I was overreacting, that I just had to wait it out, that Olivia was busy, tired, juggling too much, that Derek didn't mean to be so cruel. But when a man tells you, with his voice, his face, his actions, that you're no longer wanted, believe him. And I finally did. So around 3 a.m., wrapped in my worn-out shawl and sitting at the card table they'd stuck down there as my dining space, I picked up my old address book. The same one I used to keep tucked in the kitchen drawer back when this was still my house. My hand hovered over one name. Angela. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Not out of anger. Life had just taken us in different directions. She was my oldest friend, practically a sister. We grew up together, raised our babies side by side, cried at each other's husbands' funerals. She moved 2 states away after her son got a good job and offered to buy her a condo near him. She had called me a few times after my fall, offering to fly down and help. I declined. Told her I had Olivia, that I'd be fine. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to admit I had made a mistake. But now I saw things clearly. I dialed her number. She picked up on the 3rd ring, groggy but alert. Hello, Martha? I couldn't hold it in. The words spilled out before I could stop them. Everything. The basement. The way Derek looked at me like I was some leftover furniture. How Olivia had slowly shrunk into someone I barely recognized. How I felt like I was dying down there. Not in body, but in spirit. Angela didn't interrupt once. When I finally finished, voice shaking, she exhaled sharply. You've got 2 options, she said. Stay and let them walk all over you, or get the hell out and start living like someone who still matters. Which do you want? I was quiet. Then I said the words that changed everything. I want to leave. Without hesitation, she replied, then listen carefully. By noon the next day, everything was in motion. Angela called her son, the same one who had moved her into that cozy condo a few years back. Turns out he had recently bought a new property nearby, a large home on a peaceful street with a finished in-law suite downstairs. Private entrance, kitchen, bathroom, sunlight, no mold, no spiders, no Derek. Angela's son, Jacob, sweet boy, offered it to me rent-free for 6 months, said he could even fly down with Angela to help me pack. But I told her, no, I want to do this myself. I'd been made small for too long. It was time to stand again. I gave myself one more night in that basement, one more night to gather strength. The next morning, I climbed the stairs slowly. My hip screamed. My pride did too. But I didn't stop. Olivia was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, Derek pacing nearby, talking loudly on his Bluetooth. Neither of them looked up. I cleared my throat. They turned. Derek rolled his eyes slightly. Olivia gave me that tight, fake smile I'd come to dread. What's up, Mom? She asked. I steadied myself. I'm moving out next week. Olivia blinked. What? I'm moving out. I've made arrangements. There was a pause. Derek scoffed. Where would you even go? He said it like I was a piece of trash someone had left on the curb. Like he couldn't fathom that someone like me had options. And maybe that's the moment I stopped being hurt. Maybe that's the moment I stopped feeling like a burden and started remembering who the hell I was. I'm going to stay with people who respect me, I said, looking straight at him. You don't need to worry about my walker in the hallway anymore. Derek turned red. Olivia opened her mouth, closed it again, and I turned and walked back down to the basement. That week, I started quietly packing. Angela overnighted me boxes and labels. I sorted through my life piece by piece. I donated most of my old things. There was something liberating about letting go. The last night before I left, I sat on that mattress one last time and took a photo. to remember where I'd been, not where I'd stay. The morning of the move, a large SUV pulled into the driveway. Jacob stepped out, tall and kind-eyed. Angela followed behind with 2 cups of coffee. Olivia came to the door in a robe. She stared at them like they were aliens. "Mom, what is this?" I stepped outside with my bag in hand. "This," I said, "is called freedom." Derek didn't even come to the door. Angela hugged me tight and whispered, "You ready to go?" I looked back one last time at the house I had loved, built, sacrificed for, and I realized something. A house is just walls and windows. A home is where you are respected. I got in that car and never looked back. The sun hit my face differently that morning, not just because I was finally out of that cold, damp basement, but because I woke up somewhere I was wanted. Jacob's guest suite was brighter than anything I'd seen in months. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains. The smell of brewed coffee wafted in from upstairs, and there was no sound of Derek stomping overhead or barking at Olivia about Wi-Fi passwords or lawn care. Just peace. I felt 10 years younger. Angela spoiled me that first week. Home-cooked meals, morning walks, even if I had to go slow with the walker, gossip-filled evenings that made us laugh till our sides hurt. She didn't ask questions. She didn't treat me like I was broken. She just let me be. And for the first time in over a year, I started to feel like myself again. But here's the thing. As freeing as it was to be out of that house, something kept gnawing at me. Not because I wanted it back. No, but because I realized I had handed over the deed to that home like it was a loaf of bread. No strings, no protection, no foresight. I trusted blindly, and they counted on that. I gave everything, and they shoved me underground. Now, I wanted to teach them something they clearly never learned growing up in my house. Kindness is not weakness, and forgetting who built your foundation comes with a cost. So I pulled out a little file folder I'd brought with me. I had grabbed it at the last minute before leaving. Something told me not to leave it behind. It had copies of the house deed, my original will, old letters from my late husband, and notes from the last estate attorney we'd worked with before he passed. I flipped through the documents slowly. Then I saw it. A clause my husband had insisted on back in the day, bless his soul. It was buried deep in the deed transfer documents from when I'd signed the house over to Olivia. Something called a life estate. It meant that while Olivia owned the house on paper, I still retained full legal rights to live there, for as long as I was alive. They couldn't evict me. They couldn't force me into the basement. And if they violated my right to quiet enjoyment of the property, I had legal grounds to reclaim it. I sat there in stunned silence. They probably never even read the paperwork carefully, just saw the title transfer and assumed they had full control. I nearly laughed out loud. But I wasn't about revenge. I didn't want to go to war. I didn't want to make them miserable, even after everything. What I wanted was accountability. So I picked up the phone and made one more call to Mr. Samuel Dwyer, the estate lawyer my husband had trusted with everything. He was retired now, mostly working as a consultant, but when he heard my name, his voice lit up. He remembered me instantly. Remembered how my husband had insisted on protecting me even after death. Remembered that clause. And when I told him what happened, he got quiet for a second before saying, "Would you like me to send a letter to your daughter and her husband, or would you prefer to take formal legal action?" I paused. Then I said, "Send the letter. Just the letter. For now." He said he'd draft it and send it priority overnight. And he did. 3 days later, I got a text from Olivia, first in weeks. "Mom, we need to talk. Please." I didn't reply right away. I let her sit in the weight of it for a while. Angela saw the look on my face and raised an eyebrow. "The fish bit?" I smiled. "Oh, she bit. Now let's see if she wants to swim to shore or drown with that husband of hers." That Saturday, I agreed to meet Olivia. Just her. Neutral ground, a park we used to walk together in back when she still called me her best friend. She looked older, not in years, but in stress. Her face was pale. She was twisting her wedding ring like it was a nervous tick. I didn't know, she said quickly, about the clause, about any of it. I didn't say anything. She looked down. Derek's been stressed with work, and when you moved in, it just added. I'm not here for excuses, I said gently but firmly. I'm here for answers. She hesitated. What do you want from us? I want you to remember that I didn't just give you a house. I gave you a home. I trusted you with our family's memories. And you let your husband treat me like garbage in the same place where I once rocked you to sleep. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't soften. Not yet. You have two options, Olivia. I either return and we draft a new agreement where I have a real living space in the house on the main floor with dignity, or we take it to court. And I guarantee I'll win. You might hold the deed, but the law is still on my side. She blinked, stunned. You'd come back? I smiled. No, I won't. I could, but I won't. I'm not looking to punish you. I'm looking to protect myself. That clause means if I ever want to return, I have every right to do so. And if you ever try to sell that house without my consent, I let the silence do the talking. Her mouth fell open. We were actually considering it. I nodded. I figured. She left the park shaken, and I left with a lighter heart, because now the power wasn't in that house. It wasn't in that basement. It was in me. It's strange how quickly the tides turn when people realize you're not as powerless as they assumed. The letter from my lawyer had shaken Derek and Olivia to the core. I could almost hear the panic in Derek's voice through Olivia's text messages. Suddenly, the man who barked orders at me like I was some stray mutt in his basement was asking for a chance to make things right. Too little, too late. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. And I had no intention of crawling back to that house, not even into a suite with windows and warm blankets. That house had become a symbol of everything I had allowed to happen in the name of keeping the peace. No more. But I wasn't done yet. Because as I reviewed the documents with Mr. Dwyer again, he said something that made me pause. Did you know that your original will still stand unless explicitly revoked, he asked. You left that house to Olivia and any residual inheritance to be split between her and your nephew in Colorado. I blinked. My nephew? David? Yes. That was before your husband passed. He was added as a backup beneficiary. That made me think. I hadn't spoken to David in years. We drifted after his mother, my sister, passed away. But I remembered a young man who used to sit at my kitchen table, helping me set up my email or laughing about how slow I typed. He was a good boy, polite, grateful, the kind of person who would never treat family like clutter shoved into a basement corner. So I called him, and just like that, the floodgates opened. Auntie Mags? His voice was stunned. Is it really you? We talked for nearly 2 hours, about life, about family, about what had happened. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't rant either. Just laid it out. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I'll never forget. You come live with me, Auntie. I've got the space, and I want you here. You don't need to stay one more second with people who treat you like less than you are. My eyes stung. I didn't realize how much I'd needed to hear those exact words, but that's when it clicked. I didn't need the house back. I didn't even need an apology. What I needed was a reset, a clean break, one that wouldn't leave me vulnerable again. So I met with Mr. Dwyer one more time and rewrote my will from top to bottom. The house Olivia currently lived in, removed from her future inheritance. She could keep the title for now, live in her Queen of the Castle fantasy. But once I passed, it would revert to David, legally airtight. I also added a clause that if she or Derek ever attempted to sell the property while I was alive and without my approval, I had the right to revoke occupancy entirely. I signed the documents, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't felt since before Derek ever set foot in my life. Then, as a final courtesy, I sent one last letter, not from the lawyer, but from me, just a simple envelope with a handwritten note inside. Dear Olivia, you may own the house, but I own the land your marriage is standing on. That basement you locked me in, it taught me more than you could imagine. I'm done sleeping in the dark. I hope you and Derek enjoy the illusion of control for as long as it lasts. Love, Mom, or as Derek liked to call me, the lady in the basement. Angela laughed for 5 straight minutes when I showed her the letter. David flew out 2 weeks later to help me pack the few things I'd taken with me, and he handled everything with care. Even the framed photo of Olivia when she was 5, holding a daisy and smiling like she had the whole world ahead of her. I kept it, not because I still saw that little girl, but because it reminded me that I'd once raised someone full of innocence and hope, and that version of her, no matter how far gone, deserved better than the man she married and the choices she'd made. As we drove toward David's home, toward my new home, I watched the skyline shift. For the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped playing the role they cast for me. I left that house quietly. No shouting, no drama. Just a woman with a suitcase, her spine a little straighter, and her soul a little lighter. David's home was everything mine used to be. Before Derek. Warm, welcoming, safe. He had fixed up the guest room just for me, stocked the pantry with my favorite tea, and set up a small reading nook near a window that caught the sunrise. It wasn't a palace, but it was home, a real one. And for a few peaceful weeks, I allowed myself to just breathe. But then the phone calls started. Olivia first. I didn't pick up. Then Derek, 3 missed calls and 1 voice message that made my skin crawl. Maggie, we need to talk. You've made a mistake. A serious one, and I don't think you understand the kind of consequences that can come from. Delete. And then, silence. Until one morning, David handed me his phone. You should see this, he said, trying not to smirk. It was a listing on a property site. My old house. For sale. Except Derek and Olivia hadn't read the fine print. See, the house may have been in Olivia's name, but the land lease, which I had quietly filed through my lawyer years ago when we first did the title transfer, had a clause. Any sale or lease of the property required co-signature from the leaseholder, me. And without my signature, the sale was null. Worse for them, the buyers had already put down a deposit. Derek had used part of that money to place a payment on a new dream home in a flashy suburb. His credit was leveraged. The sale fell through. And then the buyer sued. It was a mess. A public, expensive mess. By the time Derek realized what had happened, he was in deep legal waters. And Olivia? She finally called again, but this time her voice didn't sound angry or arrogant. It sounded small. Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know all of it. He said he checked the paperwork. I thought you just wanted to leave. I didn't think. I interrupted gently. You didn't think, Olivia. That's the problem. Silence. I didn't hang up. I just waited. I miss you. A lump formed in my throat, but I swallowed it. You miss the version of me who didn't speak up, who accepted disrespect in exchange for your approval. That woman's gone, she cried. I let her, but I didn't offer comfort, not this time. That night, I went out to the back patio of David's house. He was grilling steaks, and we sat outside, sipping sweet tea under the fairy lights he'd strung up just for me. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Giving her the house? I thought for a moment, then smiled. No, I said. I regret not knowing my own worth sooner. 6 months later, Olivia and Derek separated. No surprise there. Turns out financial ruin can shake even the strongest power couple image. Derek left, took his truck, his pride, and whatever scraps of money he had left, and vanished. Olivia called again. I didn't answer. I wasn't angry anymore. I just had nothing left to give her. Not sympathy. Not silence. Not space in my life. because for once I was spending my golden years actually living. I joined a book club, took a watercolor class, even went on a weekend trip to the mountains with Angela and her hilarious group of knitting friends who drink more wine than they knit. And David? He didn't just offer me a room. He offered me family again, the kind that doesn't measure your worth by how quiet you stay, but by how brightly you shine. So yes, I gave my daughter the house, but in doing so, I gave myself something far greater. Freedom.